are we doing today? My name is Ajak. I'm here with the wonderful professor, Miss Katungi. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Professor Katungi.
All right, and my first question for you is, in your mind, what is a stereotype?
What is a stereotype? Stereotypes are thoughts about people, groups, usually based out of some type of historical context, but usually has derogatory connotations, and can be used to kind of demean different people, groups, depending on what the stereotype is. Yeah, and marginalize, yeah. And they're usually things that as time goes on, people don't usually know where they come from, but will believe in them, right? So there's like a lot of ideas that people will have that they have no idea, but it's a stereotype that they believe.
And I would just like to say, like, what I've learned is that is an effect of social engineering, like just the way society is just pumping certain ideas and images into people's subconscious.
And the media has a lot to do with stereotypes and the way we think about them. In one of my classes, we talk a lot about the ways that you can go halfway across the world and people will have ideas about African Americans because of the stereotypes that they've seen and consumed, even if they've never met. And you can say that about any group that's been stereotyped.
So my next question is, why do you think people stereotype?
Why do I think people stereotype? I think stereotypes have served a lot of purposes. I think stereotypes have been used to justify different forms of oppression, to legitimize things like the ideology of white supremacy, and then I think that people will fall into kind of the myths that they think of as facts, right? And so some people are really connected to stereotypes because they just believe them to be true, even though they're not really sure where those ideas come from. And so they can be passed down for generation after generation.
So my next question is, growing up, were you ever introduced to any stereotypes? Were you ever taught any stereotypes?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think there were just lots of stereotypes. I was always concerned about Black people, so those always stood out to me. I was raised in a household, at least for the first few, up until I was about 10, 11, where we talked really openly about the Black experience, and the Black experience beyond even the U.S. experience. And so, because my father's from Uganda, my mother's from Nebraska, and so there was lots of conversations and history lessons that were happening. So by the time I was kind of introduced to some stereotypes, like I recognized them as bad, but usually they were just things that I encountered in school, things that other friends, like peer groups, would say to me, things that I watched on television. The first time that I ever really recognized that stereotypes could be something that people consume and aren't aware of, I was probably about 7. And I remember it because my mom was showing me a cartoon. Like, we went to the video store and got some movies, and my mom wanted to share a cartoon that she watched when she was a little girl called Little Lulu. And so I remember distinctly we started watching it, and then very quickly a couple of images came on very similar to some of the images that we showed in 140B with ethnic images, with ethnic notions. Just a mammy or kind of Sambo kind of caricatures. I didn't recognize that at the time, right? But my mom did, and she jumped up immediately, stopped the film, and was like, "Oh no, we're not doing this." But the funny thing is she had to teach me that she didn't. When she was a child, she watched that and had no idea. So it wasn't until she was an adult trying to share it with her children that she recognized how problematic the images that she consumed as a child were. So I've never forgotten that, because it just always stood out to me, because she had such an instant reaction to it, like, we're not going to watch this. So that's what I mean by I was introduced to stereotypes, but I was kind of early on introduced to people kind of pushing back against stereotypes.
So it was pros and cons.
Pros and cons, yeah. But mostly in school. Everything else that I learned was from my peers, and peers can lead you astray.
Yeah,
definitely.
So my next question after that is, did stereotyping benefit you in any way?
Did stereotyping benefit me? No. I think that I was confused by some stereotypes, especially as I became like a teenager. Lots of stereotypes about Black women, and some of the things that I was naturally like good at. I mean, people would sometimes reframe it, so I was really kind of articulate, and I wasn't people would call me aggressive, right? But I was someone who just kind of stood on principle. I was always kind of challenging authority in ways that was healthy, and that if someone in a different kind of who presented different than I did might have had a different response. And so kind of like the angry Black woman,
Exactly.
the overly aggressive, the attitude, and there's nothing wrong with attitude, right? Or sass. I had a student even call me sassy one time a couple of years ago, and I responded like, well, why are you calling me sassy? And it was about this way that I noticed that I had been pushing back against people putting me in boxes. So I think that in some ways, there were times in my life where I recognized that people were stereotyping me, and it made me hyper aware of myself in ways that I don't think were helpful for my development. And eventually I had to get to the point where I don't care. But it definitely, when you're put in a box, even if you're thriving, it can hold you back. Yeah.
Because the illusion is still there.
Yeah, yeah. And I had friends, like I mean in school, my teachers I was always in really advanced classes. I was always really into, obviously education is important to me, but if I was, say, surrounded by white students, which I often was in my classrooms, then I would be the one who was targeted. So
that's perfect to lead into my next question, which is, have you ever dealt with discrimination, and how did that make you feel?
Oh yeah, all the time in high school. Like I was accused of cheating oftentimes by substitutes. I was placed in the back of the classroom once because my math teacher thought I was disruptive, when really it was everyone around me who was disruptive. There were a lot of people that I've worked with. I've struggled in jobs where I might have had a supervisor who didn't understand like my personality or the way I go after things or my questions, or I'm inquisitive. So oftentimes authority, especially if the person was white, has been a problem for me since probably about high school. Yeah.
My next question is, are there any stereotypes that you perpetuate consciously or subconsciously?
Oh, I'm sure there's some that I perpetuate subconsciously. I'm sure there's some stereotypes that I think that we all kind of have unconscious bias. I think it's just part of being part of this society. I think we can actively work against it, but you have to usually be taught those things.
And I like that because earlier you explained that a stereotype that you felt was put upon you in your life was the brash, the angry Black womanish, which is, you know, just far-fetched. But you just being a strong woman in general, that would perpetuate that. For some people, that would be like a perpetuation of the
right.
stereotype,
Or how people read me. Like
exactly.
If they don't see me as a full person, that's how that'll come off to them oftentimes, and that happens on a daily basis. And when I'm interacting with people, when I take my dog to the vet and I've got questions, when I go to the dentist and I'm someone who's literally a month away from having a PhD, and I just don't want my dentist to call me kiddo, things like that. There's just certain things that I just push back against, but I come off a certain way, and I recognize that I come off a certain way. I don't know who that is. I'm listening.
All right, just last two questions. So first one is, what bothers you the most about your people, in a sense, when it comes to stereotyping and how they respond to that?
About in terms of my people, like Black people?
Yes.
Sometimes, and I'll speak as someone, especially like in the classroom, where sometimes I'll see folks kind of trapped by stereotypes, right? Like there's ideas about Black people that we're not into education, that we don't care about school, that people are just coming in to just kind of shuck and jive, you know what I mean? Like those types of things. And sometimes I see some of that. Sometimes I see some of the ways that maybe high schools have not served students, right? Not prepared them, not made people feel valued, not made students feel like they own their educational experience. And then by the time they come to me, it's like, all right, here, what are we doing here? Why are we acting like we're not paying for this? And financial aid is usually student loans. And so that is always bothersome. But what I will say is the joy of teaching African American studies and history in particular is that a lot of people are touched by the material, and a lot of folks will, even if it's that one moment where we watch Ethnic Notions and they see like, oh, like I didn't know that I believed that, but this is an idea that pre-existed me, or find hope in like thinking about Black leadership, or learn something in the class that they realize they didn't learn before. Usually is kind of a way to kind of help disrupt stereotypes. And then sometimes folks who were kind of falling into a box the first time around, by the time I see them the second semester, it's a different story.
A whole new person.
Yeah. And sometimes that happens within a semester, but usually it happens like someone is going through stuff and then they realize that they want something different from themselves, and they believe something different from themselves. And sometimes that's not my class. Sometimes it's they take Professor Lewis's class, and then they have all this kind of energy about who they are apart from stereotypes. But I think that we fall into the trappings of believing stereotypes ourselves.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's all too true. My last question for you is, do you think that any of the issues in society today are a result of stereotypes?
Oh yeah. And stereotypes are just one piece of this larger kind of issue, and some of I know they're big concepts, right? But like when I say like the ideology of white supremacy as being a foundation of this country, like that's where some stereotypes are coming from. And so sometimes stereotypes are really just demonstrating what's happening kind of beyond even those ideas. And so I see that all the time. We're living in Trump's America right now, where literally we watched him campaign off of stereotypes, and really vicious, violent stereotypes, and not just about one group, right? Like lots of marginalized groups, and the ways in which that is also inspiring other people to be very hateful, right? So there's a lot of that, yeah. I think our society is riddled with all the problems of stereotypes.
It's an epidemic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no, that was an important conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. That's
Anything else?
Yeah, actually, if you could elaborate earlier, the question before this was about basically just students almost kind of putting themselves in the box of a stereotype. My question is, so when they don't, go through self-evaluation and kind of come out of that cocoon, if you will, how do you combat that as an educator? How do you influence that and kind of be the driving force behind, I guess,
I try to do
students?
it through example, right? And I just kind of like emphasize my own passion and interest in the material and what it does, and also recognizing, and this one's taken me a while, that people are at different places, and not everybody is going to come to the same kind of conclusions at the same pace as others. That's been a hard one for me as an instructor. Some of my own colleagues have helped me with that. Professor Lewis always helps remind me, just wait, be patient. Teaching, being here long enough to recognize again that sometimes some of the most hard-headed students in one semester will be the shining stars in a couple of years, and sometimes 5 years later that happens. And also just to try not to internalize it too much. But it's hard, because as much as some people don't care, but I really care. I actually care about the material. I care about everybody in my class. I hope that people connect with it. I hope that it makes a difference. And sometimes I have to stop and say, you don't reach everybody, and not everybody's ready. And then sometimes I gotta go home and sleep on that and try again the next day, right? Y'all frustrating the hell out of me by week 10. Everybody knows that. I'm snapping, but I warn y'all, right? I told y'all beginning of the semester, I was like, by week 10, I'm going off on somebody.
What week is this now?
We're in 13.
Okay.
Oh,
dang.
So part of it is just also some self-reflection and to also not be such a narcissist, right? Like, it's not my job to save everyone, but to just hope that that something makes an impact. And to be honest, peers make far more impact than I do. And so oftentimes what'll happen is students will see others into like the material or deciding a different path for themselves, and they'll think, oh, what's that all about? And so they start kind of looking into that more so than trying to do something to pass a class or not.
I mean, I feel like, you know, it's like almost like I love hip hop, so I'm gonna make a Tupac reference. It's, you're gonna spark the mind. That's what you're here. You're here to spark the mind and that interest for them to, you know, continue that journey on with education.
Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I'm just, you've done that for me.
Oh, I'm glad.
And you know, so I just
Agreed.
thank you for that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the hope, and it happens, and connecting to those. And so one of the things that I usually say in class, right, when especially as it starts dwindling, and you may notice it or not, but I usually say, I'm happy you're here, right? Like, we're small but mighty. I'm happy that you made it, right? Because at the end of the day, I can chase those who don't want to be here, or I can connect with those who do. And usually it kind of full cycles itself, or full circles itself. And sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes, you know, I got a student who's basically giving me the finger by the end of the class, and that's okay too, because I teach over 300 students a semester. So, you know, if I can get a handful that are interested in moving these ideas forward, right? Because Black Studies is not just about education for education's sake, it's also about liberation. And,
Definitely.
And that's a big piece of what I believe wholeheartedly. So that's what I try and do. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you.
All right, cool.
Yeah, this is